Okay, right. I'm going to do a quick introduction to me and then I'm going to start the presentation. You can turn yourselves off if you want to. You don't have to, it's fine. I'll be sharing slides throughout most of it. So,
Yeah, I'll turn myself off then.
okay,
Yeah,
cool.
I'll do that now.
Right. Hello and welcome to this free lunchtime webinar. Thank you very much for coming. First of all, a quick introduction. I'm Karen Adams of Rather Good Limited, and I work with individuals and small teams, both at a management level and across the wider organisation, to help improve communication and mindset. I use a combination of workshops, training, and one-to-one coaching to ensure everyone understands themselves, their clients, and their colleagues so they can feel happier about their work and, as a bonus, be more effective. You can find me on LinkedIn or at my website, rathergoodcoaching.com. Today's webinar is going to be focused on dealing with difficult people. We all know people who seem to have been put on this earth just to be irritating, just like it's their mission to annoy us. But when the red mist of rage clears and we've had time for a restorative cup of tea and a bit of a sit down, we kind of realise that it's unlikely that it's their whole life's mission to irritate us. So why are they being such a pain? I'm going to share my screen so I can show you some slides throughout the presentation. And okay, marvelous. Let's see how this one goes. In this webinar, I'm going to discuss the problem of difficult people, why they exist and what we can do about it. Just to be clear, I will not be talking about murder. This webinar will actively discourage the use of bodily harm to others, however annoying they might be. I will talk to you, I will talk generally about problem patterns and how knowing more about them can help. I'll give you some top tips to bear in mind when dealing with difficult people. You will get to find out about the Pygmalion effect and negativity bias. Towards the end, I'll give you some tools that will help you to change your thought patterns and manage conversations better. Please have a paper and pen nearby during the webinar so you can take notes if you want to. And especially if you have any thoughts or questions that you want to ask later or discuss, please write them down so you don't forget. Because right at the end, I've allowed a bit of time for discussion. So if you put any questions or comments in writing so you can bring them up at that time, that would be great. And I think you've all muted yourselves anyway during the presentation. And be aware that I won't be monitoring the chat as I'll be concentrating on the presentation. And now, on with the show. The first thing to realise is that most people think of themselves as the hero of their own lives, not as the villain in someone else's tale. Most people respond to the circumstances around them as well as they can. Unfortunately, if you and others find them difficult, this response may have left much to be desired. Why would you care about listening to someone who is just being mean or shouting out accusations? You probably don't. I wouldn't. It probably didn't go well in the past. But honestly, as much as we'd like to avoid difficult people, we can't. I'm going to go through 7 points about dealing with difficult people, why we have to, and what we can sensibly do about it. Point 1. No one wants difficult people in their life. Seriously, no one. It makes life more challenging and less fun. We end up wishing that they, or we, were at the other end of the country, without internet, so that we won't have to talk to them. Point number 2. We can't avoid dealing with difficult people when they're colleagues or clients. We might consider leaving our jobs or making someone else deal with them, but this can result in new problems. Sometimes we have to deal with unpleasant people because they flew under the radar when they were introduced to the company in the first place. Generally, a company will screen clients and new starters, so we only have to work with people who suit us. After all, we passed the test in the first place. When I interviewed for my apprenticeship, the first round of the application process was an aptitude test that all prospective employees took at the same time. After the test, one chap in the group was talking about how difficult he'd found certain aspects of the test. Another person in the group was rolling his eyes and being disparaging about the fact that the other guy found this difficult. The chap who had difficulties on the test was one of those hired. The chap who was mean about his abilities was not. Sometimes if someone is difficult to work with, they have something about the way they interact with people has changed since they started with the company. Though it is possible that everyone's just closing their eyes and thinking of the money. Point 3, we want them to stop being difficult. It's stressing us out and we aren't enjoying life so much as we're dreading our next interaction with the awkward person. Life would be so much easier if they stopped being awkward, but point 4, they are unlikely to change their behaviour spontaneously. Much as we might want them to, this rarely happens. Most people don't think of themselves as difficult, and, as I said previously, no one thinks of themselves as the villain in someone else's story. Some people may realise they're difficult, but they're unlikely to see their behaviour as unreasonable. They're merely responding to circumstances after all. And sometimes they even have a point. For example, if they're a client and they're supposed to be telling us what they want, it's reasonable to expect they will ask some questions. To them, the fact that we find it irritating is our problem. In their mind, we are the ones who don't understand. Point number 5. The easiest thing to influence is our own behaviour and attitude. We can approach a conversation with the aim of having a simple chat and getting on with the rest of our day. If we go in expecting it to be difficult and feeling angry before we even start, we're setting ourselves up for an even worse experience. If we remain curious about what they will say and why, then we open ourselves up to learning and the potential for a better, more productive conversation. I'll come back to this later. Point number 6. Changing any of the variables in a situation can change the difficulty we encounter. If we put ourselves in a better frame of mind, we can be more positive and curious about the other person, and we can become the change variable in the situation. And when any variable changes, in this case us, the actions the other person previously took may no longer be appropriate. So the difficult person may change to be more open or easier to deal with than we gave them the opportunity to be before. Point number 7. We have the power to make them disappear. Have you ever been in such a fabulous mood that nothing can touch you? You feel high on life and happy with the whole world, even those you usually find irritating? On a more mundane level, if you no longer see the person as difficult or you view the situation as easier, you just made the problem disappear. Now that is a magic trick well worth learning. Problem patterns. When we find another person consistently difficult, we eventually slip into a problem pattern. This is where we have a predictable pattern that characterizes every interaction, and eventually we go into a conversation already knowing more or less what will happen. If you think about your problematic interactions, you can always think of something the other person can do to change their behavior and fix the pattern. In general, the other person is also aware of the problem pattern and has their own ideas about fixing it. Their ideas will often involve you changing your behavior. You may have heard the saying, with great power comes great responsibility. Well, it turns out that when we're dealing with others, the reverse can also be true. When we take responsibility, we can access great power. And if we're willing to take the first step, we can effect tremendous change. Initially, this can feel deeply uncomfortable. We do not like to feel we're in the wrong, and modifying our behavior can seem like an admission of fault. Even worse, it can feel like we're bending to suit someone else's whim. But there's another way to look at it. We can think of it as taking the initiative to change the problem pattern. Taking responsibility for everyone else's experience gives us a lot of power. If we take control of a conversation and manage its direction, we can influence how good the outcome will be. When we come across people we find a pain to deal with, be they whiny or stubborn or bullish, underneath all that, they are still human, and we have a lot in common, often including things we'd rather not admit to. Focusing on the similarities instead of the differences, looking for the good, can form a foundation for changing our experiences with them. The most important things to bear in mind when dealing with difficult people. First up, listen to them. Often people who are labelled as difficult look at the world in a way that is different to others and takes a while to get used to. If we pay attention to what they say and listen to them, This can help us understand their perspective and enable us to talk to them more easily. But why me, I hear you cry. It's them being a pain in the backside. Why should I waste my time? It's a fair question. And the answer to that is the relatively simple act of taking the time to listen to someone can have a huge impact. It can release tension and stress and help everyone, including you, to get to the heart of a problem. It can also help bring open issues that need resolution so we can deal with them. Asking questions and listening to the answers can really help us to understand other perspectives, and listening can be powerful on its own. I even have an example from my own work history that proves it. A few years ago, I had a colleague, let's call her Daisy, who was considered difficult to work with. Daisy's most irritating trait was her incessant complaining. But sitting next to her in a site office for several months, I realised she didn't always do this. And eventually, I realised that if I spent 10 minutes in the morning listening to her complain, she would mellow out for the rest of the day. Once I realised the pattern and started to put in my morning listening practice, Daisy became one of the most helpful and obliging people I've ever worked with. 2. Respect them. Even if we find someone difficult, we need to acknowledge that they have skills and experience of great value, and that we need to be comfortable with the fact that other people look at the world differently. Interestingly, one of the easiest ways of showing this respect is by listening attentively and with real interest, and not just waiting for our own chance to speak. We need to understand that others' opinions and experiences are important. Their conclusions and reasoning may be flawed, but they might not be. We won't find out if we don't listen to them and take the time to understand their reasoning. This lack of understanding is common in a lot of industries, particularly between the more senior and the more junior staff. That stubborn old guy in the corner who won't move with the times, call him Bill, often has a lot of experience with previous initiatives that didn't last. Listening to Bill and using his expertise can help you troubleshoot a new initiative and get it working better before it even starts. Bill could even become one of the initiative's most ardent supporters if you could get the system working in a way he approves of. And the fact that Claire's just started and is 20 years younger does not mean she has nothing of value to share. She may have learned something at college that's the perfect way of dealing with this problem, or perhaps she will just have the fresh perspective that you didn't even know you were looking for. Number 3, respect yourself. When dealing with someone particularly assertive, there's a risk they'll walk all over you if you don't stand your ground. Fortunately, this does not mean you have to argue with them or be inflexible in your views. Sharing your viewpoint does not mean you're not listening to theirs. Showing respect for ourselves and our opinions can be part of believing in the potential for collaboration. Having and maintaining boundaries and setting up clear guidelines for future interactions can save us a lot of time and stress down the line. If we need to explain another viewpoint to someone, a useful tool for this is the experience puzzle, which I'll describe a bit later in the webinar. Respectfully pointing out an opposing view to someone who is assertive and strong-minded may well be appreciated, especially if it adds to their understanding of a situation. Assertive people often have plenty of self-respect and expect to see it in others. If you treat yourself with the same respect you give them, you'll usually get on just fine. Which leads us to a very useful discovery about expectations. What we expect of someone can affect how they behave. Robert Rosenthal, a professor of social psychology at Harvard University, and Lenore Jacobson, an elementary school principal, conducted a well-known experiment into people's expectations. It was called Pygmalion in the Classroom and was published in 1968. For those of you who are curious, Pygmalion was a sculptor in Greek mythology who fell in love with one of his own creations. When he prayed to the gods, the sculpture came to life, and man and ex-statue lived together happily. Rosenthal and Jacobson were inspired by this story and named their findings after the legendary sculptor. Anyway, back in 1965, Rosenthal and Jacobson had students take an IQ test and told his teachers that, based on these results, certain students were expected to perform particularly well. At the end of the school year, the results of all the children were assessed, and it was found that the children labelled as bloomers and expected to do well actually did outstrip their classmates. In reality, those bloomers had been selected at random, and there was nothing special about the results of their IQ tests. It was found that the teachers' enhanced expectations and subsequent special treatment was what caused the students' high performance. This may be the most famous study, but it's not the only one. This knowledge, that people will often become what we believe them to be, can be used to improve our relations with them. If we believe they're smart, knowledgeable, and reasonable, then that's what they'll become. Concerning neutrality, the main spanner in the works when we come to apply this is another natural human tendency, this one being our negative bias. Human brains are hardwired to see the negative in a situation, and from an evolutionary standpoint, this is perfect and makes absolute sense. As an early human, hearing a rustling in the bushes thinks, "Oh no, a lion!" He runs away and lives to pass on his genes to the next generation. As the culmination of many millennia of survival, I deeply approve of this. On the other hand, this useful negativity bias from our ancient past comes with a strong tendency to see the bad in any situation and is still a driver of behavior in the present day. This can often be less than helpful in 21st century life. It's worth remembering this tendency of the human brain, so when we're being negative, we can do a quick internal check. Am I catastrophizing? How likely is this to happen? Even if it did, what's the worst case scenario? Is it really life or death? Learning to spot our negative biases can be useful. When we notice we're doing it, we can use some simple tricks to put ourselves in a more positive frame of mind and give ourselves a better chance of dealing effectively with others. Barbara Fredrickson describes two types of negativity in her book Positivity. Start there. Type 1, necessary negativity. Negative emotion can be essential in dealing with the circumstances we find ourselves in. It's necessary if it's proportional to the facts and is a reasonable and appropriate response to the situation. If someone tramples all over one of our boundaries and we get angry, as long as it motivates us to do something about it, it's useful. Being upset because of an argument is reasonable. Going over it repeatedly and exhaustively for the rest of the day is not. Negative emotion is useless if it stops us from growing and moving forward. Type 2, gratuitous negativity. When we allow ourselves to get swept up in negative emotions, they become unnecessary. Sometimes we get carried away by negative emotions and indulge in the urge to stoke them higher rather than finding a way to deal with them. When we get stuck in this negativity spiral, we no longer deal effectively with the problems around us. Some sources of entertainment can also spark this gratuitous negativity. For a personal example, watching the news makes me angry. For me, this had an easy solution. I simply stopped watching it. Listening to certain types of music can make me feel depressed, but this took me a lot longer to realise. The solution is a bit more nuanced. I can still listen to that music if I want to, but I feel better and respond better to the world around me and the people around me if I don't hear it all the time. It's possible that neither of these things are a problem for you, but it is worth knowing what sort of things get you angry or depressed. If you know, you've got a leg up on dealing with it. What can we do to stop gratuitous negativity taking over? Fredrickson devotes a whole chapter of her book to this. In a nutshell, we need to measure our emotional reactions against the evidence and take action to change if we realize our response is disproportionate. Anything that can adequately absorb our attention can work to keep us out of the spiral. We can use mindfulness to get ourselves back on track. One simple way of doing this is to slowly rub your index finger against your thumb so you can feel the individual ridges of your fingerprint. Focus on the sensations and you will have refocused your brain. This is good as a quick fix when we're out and about, and there are plenty of other mindset techniques you can use, including the NLP technique of anchoring yourself into a better frame of mind. When we have time, sources of entertainment that we know make us feel positive emotions, such as reading, films, music, and games, can also pull us out of a negativity spiral. Use feel-good playlists. Think about what songs tend to put you in a good mood and add them in. Next time you're feeling a bit negative, experiment with listening to them and notice what happens. Go for a walk or have a dance party in your living room. You can always make an exclusive one-person guest list if you don't want to look daft in front of others. Remember, what works for you won't always work for other people. Just try out different things for yourself and keep experimenting until you find out what works best for you. It might take a bit of work, but it is worth it. And the more we practice, the easier and more automatic it becomes. One exercise I've found useful in readjusting my thinking is to list what I like or admire about someone. The fact that I don't have good experiences with them doesn't mean they have no positive traits. Neither does it mean they're not well liked by others. For an easy starting point, try asking a mutual friend what they like about the person. In the end, though, we must learn to see these positive traits for ourselves. Ask yourself, what are my best experiences of that person? What could I have seen or heard them doing that impressed me? How could I reframe my perception of their behaviour or habit so I find it less irritating? When you know you'll be talking to them, spend a minute or so going over their positive traits beforehand. Having a positive image of them in your mind during future interactions can help you achieve better outcomes. Have a positive conversation by asking appreciative questions. Let's start by answering the obvious question. What is an appreciative question? An appreciative question focuses on positive experiences and what is good about a person, situation, or anything else we want to think about. Here's a recent example of the effect of an appreciative question from my own life. I was talking to my parents, and I realised the conversation had turned quite downbeat as we were speaking about politics and the economy. When we reached a pause in the conversation, my training kicked in, and I thought to ask them, "What's the highlight of your week?" We then spent the last part of the conversation talking about the fantastic day out they'd had on Sunday, complete with a couple of concerts and a tasty lunch. I never would have heard about it if I hadn't asked them that appreciative question, and we got to the end of the conversation on a far more cheerful note. When we have difficult relationships with people, it can be even more important to have positive conversations as it improves the statistics. We feel more optimistic about interacting with them, which works both ways. A conversation based on asking appreciative questions can positively affect more challenging conversations you need to have later on. Why do appreciative questions work? Ultimately, appreciative questions work because they tap into positive emotions. Barbara Fredrickson, in her book Positivity, mentions 10 positive emotions we can tap into and access our brain-expanding potential. These emotions are joy, gratitude, serenity, interest, hope, pride, amusement, inspiration, awe, and love. When people talk about positive emotions, the ones most commonly talked about are often not emotions we tend to associate with a work environment. Gratitude, serenity. Sometimes finding those at work can seem like a tall order. Tapping into positive emotions can look a bit different in a work environment. We might feel interest in the details of a task and in our colleagues' stories. We take pride in a job well done, feel amusement in the office banter, and feel inspired by something exceptionally good that a colleague has created. These are all emotions I've felt at work, and I don't think I'm alone in that. So how do we use these appreciative questions? Interestingly, despite what you might think, it's not all that jarring to ask about good things when facing problems. Ideally, we'll wait for a pause in the conversation and use an appreciative question to redirect. In my conversation with my parents, I asked about the highlight of their week. If we ask a spouse or child about their day, we might want to ask what they were most proud of. I find it can be good to be a little bit careful when asking about the best part of someone's day. I've sometimes had the answer, coming home, which may be charming when coming from a beloved family member, but doesn't help anyone refocus on their achievements. When we're talking to a colleague, we can ask them about their best experiences and what work they're most proud of. This can be especially helpful when we're all getting a bit cynical and it's hard to remember why we're even bothering. Remember, considering the answers to appreciative questions forces our brains to look for the positive, and these positive emotions help us be more open-minded and creative in solving problems. So whenever we're mired in problems is a perfect time to ask an appreciative question. In his book Clear Leadership, Jervis Bush describes a useful four-part model for looking at an experience. He called it the experience cube, but I had to rename it as both myself and those I work with struggle with the idea of a four-part cube. I gave it a new title that felt slightly more appropriate. As per the illustration, the four parts are observe, think, feel, and want. I'll go over each in a bit more detail. Observe. This is the neutral data that comes in via our senses. It's what we see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. There's no judgment or value placed on the information in this part of the experience. Think. When observational data lands in our brains, we evaluate it and place meaning on it. We make up stories and come to conclusions. These thoughts could be positive, negative, or neutral. To clarify, it isn't bad that we come to conclusions from our observations. It's helpful to be able to think, evaluate, and make judgments. Making generalized judgments from our observational data is really useful in many contexts. Like door handles, for example. When we see a door handle, we recognize it from our previous encounters and use it to open a door. We don't have to go back to first principles to figure out how a door works every time. This generalizing can be a little bit more problematic when we're dealing with people. We need to understand that it is our thinking and is separate from what we observe. Feel. This is our emotional response to whatever's going on, and it triggers our knee-jerk reaction. We often confuse this with what we think, and we post-rationalize our feelings. Evaluating our feelings as a separate component of our overall experience helps us notice when we're doing this. Want. This is what we'd like to get out of a situation, our ideal outcome. The more basic or high level we can get with this, the better, but there are more than one ways of satisfying it if we don't get hung up on one particular idea. Piecing it together. An example. So if I'm talking to someone, I might observe that they're not looking at my face, but over my shoulder. I might think they're not paying attention to what I'm saying. This might cause me to feel angry, and what I want might be for the person to pay attention to me. Of course, this might not match the other person's experience at all. They may have just been looking over my shoulder only briefly to rest their eyes. If I get angry and assume my assessment of the situation is correct, I've missed an opportunity to have a clear communication with them. Once we know what parts of our experience are genuinely neutral and what parts are our own reactions, it's easier to realize what we don't know. We may also get an idea of what aspects of the situation we can change. We can take advantage of our increased knowledge to distance ourselves from our initial reaction, understand what motivates us, and find the best way to get what we want. The experience puzzle can also help us communicate our experience to others in a non-judgmental way. If I'm having difficulty with someone, I can go through all the elements of the experience I was having at the time and the stories I was making up about the person. They can then describe their experience of the situation to me. This allows us both to look at the situation with a better understanding of our own impact on others. We can compare notes, which aids communication and prevents either of us from feeling attacked. Either way, this improved communication can lead to better solutions as we consider other experiences as well as our own when we make decisions. So there we are. Dealing with difficult people is often about finding better ways to have difficult conversations and navigate complicated relationships. We looked at how humans in general are prone to negative bias and how we often find ourselves repeating problem patterns. We discussed using mental exercises to change how we think about a person and increase our understanding of our own experiences. We know more about putting ourselves in a positive frame of mind and why it's useful. We looked at how listening and respect are key elements in a functional relationship, especially at work. I hope you found this webinar helpful. I'm going to stop the screen share and we can take a bit of time for discussion and Q&A. You can all unmute and show your video if you want to have a chat or anything.
That was great, Karen. Really interesting. Yeah, I've got one question about neurodivergence. So I feel, looking back at my life and various difficult people I've had to deal with, that in retrospect, it was probably that they had some kind of autism or Asperger's or something that meant they weren't tuning into me and I couldn't tune into them. and I probably wasn't very tolerant of that. But now, kind of in the culture that we have now, where we're much more aware of it, I realize, oh, maybe I should have dealt with it differently in a much more forgiving way. So do you think when there is a suspicion that someone's being difficult because of neurodivergence, that it's just about being tolerant, and that, you know, even all these fantastic strategies, they might not work because someone is hard or is sort of wired differently, and that therefore we need to take, you know, see it differently?
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I'm exactly the same. There's definitely relationships I remember from my past where actually, in hindsight, I wonder if my lack of tolerance was part of the problem. I still think there's the opportunity for clear communication with people. If you explain to them what your experience is, what you're seeing, and perhaps your side of the story, that they might have the opportunity to explain how it is for them, so you can see the pattern and respond better in future. That's my thinking.
Yeah, that sounds sensible. Yeah, because they're obviously not understanding what's in my head, and if I don't explain that, then they can't move, they can't change their behavior.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. When there's Jervis Bush describes interpersonal mush, which I think is a wonderful way of talking about it. He talks about it in an organizational level, but also just between people generally. If you're all making up stories about each other and you don't actually know what's going on in someone else's mind, you're just sort of wading around and creating more problems. But you have the opportunity to start creating clarity by saying, okay, so I'm thinking this.
Yeah.
I don't know what on earth is going on for you, but this is what's happening in my head at the moment.
Yeah.
So
yeah, very wise.
I have an observation, I suppose, from my own experiences. Before I joined an office of 8 other people, I was in an office of 300 odd people, and you get an awful lot of butting of heads in those kind of environments. I think the thing I probably found the most difficult, I think it probably took me a horrendous amount of time to learn this, was the value of not saying anything in a conversation, if I can phrase it like that. When someone was busy sort of venting, it took me a long time to realize that actually there weren't that many actual questions in it. There's an awful lot of stuff that sounded quite a lot like a question but wasn't, and there was a lot of venting of general emotion, and by the time that they've let off some steam, it's if I let the conversation hit me, it would give me all sorts of emotional triggers. You know, I'd get cross, and then, you know, you just start having little arguments. And the most valuable part of that was actually learning to realize that there was nothing actually directed at, well, most of the stuff was not actually directed at me, or indeed any kind of question at all. And actually, by the time you leave it, and you just you get to the end of it, and then if there's a question at the end, you can respond to it, and actually the answers are much more human.
Yeah, to add to follow on from that, I used to work in a bookshop. This is many years ago, and we had some quite difficult clients, not clients, call them customers, who would be really just sort of aggressive from the moment that they open their mouth, just asking for something very simple, like, did we have a book in stock? And we all used to, you know, me and my colleagues, we would just think, oh, they've had a bad morning, they've had an argument with their wife, or they've they spilt the milk first thing this morning, or whatever, you know, something to realize this is not about me, this is absolutely them. And that always helped.
Yeah, it's sometimes it's the little tricks like that okay, I don't need to worry about this is not about me, this is about the milk.
Yes. Yeah.
I find it really interesting that as I guess as an organism, we are kind of hardwired to feel the impact of all that. You know, that there's this sort of thing that Yeah, certainly plenty of my colleagues were hit by that. Yeah, you're constantly hit by that, and you just kind of think it takes a realization that something's not directed at you, that it's just a thing that's a personal thing for somebody else, to not try and let those emotional triggers get pulled. But it just kind of amazes me that we're so prone to it as a species.
Well, we take everything personally often, if we're in an interaction. And we are the center of our own worlds. I mean, we can't help that.
Yeah.
So it all feels relevant to, well, it feels like it's about us, but it's not. Yeah. On another subject, Karen, if I can move on, what you said about not watching the news because you find it depressing or it makes you angry. So I completely get that. Now, I feel a kind of responsibility to watch the news, despite the fact it makes me angry, because I feel like, I'm part of this world, I'm part of society, a bit like I feel a responsibility to vote. I know the news. But so how do we reconcile that we need to be part of it, we need to know what's going on, but it makes us angry?
I think I just sort of shoved the responsibility onto everyone else. I figured if it was important enough, someone would tell me. This didn't
right. Okay, fair enough. Yeah,
there was at least one occasion where
I might try more of that.
Happening 2 weeks before I found out. But most of the time,
I think the other thing I've been experimenting with is different ways to consume the news, because I suppose the advantage of these days is there's actually quite a lot of different forms of news delivery. Aggregators are reasonably useful. You can just kind of spin down I think if you really got scientific about it, you could, ask Google and some of the other sort of aggregators out there that just sort of sift through the news and send it to you. You can generally try and tell them to filter it for the things you might actually care about rather than all the other dross.
The Week. Do you remember the magazine? I don't know if you've ever read it. It's basically a news aggregate in paper form.
Is it The Week, did you say? Yes, I know The Week.
I used to read that, and I actually quite enjoyed that, certainly in comparison to a newspaper, which I'm very argue with. But yeah. But then it comes across as a lot more balanced because it uses the different newspapers as a source. So
that's a good point. Yeah.
I think you're right. Actually, I think that was you introduced me to that, Karen. I hadn't come across it before, but they've got a nice layout, because you're right. They'll use multiple sources on the same story rather than just giving you the sort of Guardian picture or the Independent or the Telegraph or something. So yeah, or for that matter, the BBC. But yeah, it's that was actually a really good one. Plus, their cartoons are quite good.
Yeah, I was thinking that actually. Yeah, the sense of humour part does help.
This is yet another subject, really. Well, all related, obviously. I think a lot of people don't come across well in emails because they can, if they're already a little bit of a difficult person and they are giving a message without the sort of padding of niceness, it can come across as very, it's just like, how I respond to it is it's worse than if I was speaking to them because I don't have their expressions, I don't have them as a whole human. So do you think with someone who's not good at communicating by email, it's just a question of picking up the phone, which I know these days we don't really like doing, but do you think that can be a better way?
Yeah, I mean, this one I don't actually have much personal experience of. I've either worked quite closely with people. I suppose I have had emails off people, but I think in my experience, I think most of the emails tend to be quite conversational. So all the padding and niceness, it's like you're just in the middle of a conversation. The reason they haven't bothered with all the padding and the niceness, I work with trade contractors, so that's
so it's all very quick back and forth. Yeah.
It's not that they haven't said that. It's just that they said it in their head before they wrote the email.
Yeah.
That they had it. That's what they said to you last time, and this is just a furthering of the conversation that they've already had with you. So they don't need to go over all that because they've already said it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's really true.
Yeah, well, that's a good way of thinking about it with that kind of back and forth. Yeah.
I think there's an element that you've got to be you've got to work to your own strengths, and to some extent realize what your own strengths are. I was on a project once where the client agent, I suppose, who was running the whole thing, he was the project manager, and he would send. I mean, I really admired it. People, me included, can sometimes write quite lengthy emails, breaking all the rules of, no more than 5 paragraphs or something. Yeah, I laugh at those rules. But he would do the exact opposite. He would send the briefest emails I've ever seen. He would literally reply to an email and he would just write no.
And how did you feel receiving that?
I think for me, now I don't think I've ever thought about that as to necessarily what I considered at the time, but I think I probably adjusted my thinking. I think it can come across as quite brutal, but it also, I think after a while, I realized he was just being incredibly efficient. And that I mean, I was probably getting 30 to maybe 30 odd emails a day, probably. He must have been getting so many more than me, to an insane degree, and all the stuff he's copied in on. There was literally, I think the thing that worked for it, he was so efficient and possibly inept at technology. I'm not ruling out that one. He didn't have an email signature. He didn't have anything on it. Literally, the only thing he sent was 2 letters, no, or I guess yes. So you kind of, because he didn't sign it, because he didn't do anything else, there was no glossy signature, no pictures, no terms and conditions, nothing. I think because of that, it came across as, oh well, there's a guy. He's just responding in the thread. I know who it's from, and he said all that needs to be said. He doesn't need to dress it up. He's the boss. So it was, I think, but it did require, I think, a little bit of a shift in thinking to not get offended by it. And I'm not sure what I mean, benefit of hindsight, I suppose. I'm not sure what I thought about it then. No, I'm really not sure what I thought about it then.
Yeah, but that's could be quite. I mean, I feel like we all get too many emails. I think, especially if we work in an office with lots of people and we're copied into lots of things. So I think the idea of making brevity a more acceptable way of communicating is probably a good thing.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for a really interesting discussion. Actually, I'll make some notes on that.
And I want to say that I really enjoyed your anecdote about Daisy. And I feel like that's a really good example of that's stopping to listen, and then it changes their behavior. So thank you for that. That's I'm going to remember that one.
Yeah, I remember that one. It was a very, very formative experience.
Yeah.
I think I found that interesting because I had someone similar and did a similar thing. So it's interesting that that was in 2 very different offices, 2 very different places. So it's interesting that there's that parallel to it as well, that I could encounter someone very similar and actually use the same technique, learned over a number of painful months.
It's good when you finally get it, though, isn't it? That sort of revelation, and suddenly your life's so much easier.
Yeah.
You look like a wizard to all of your colleagues as well, which is always nice.
You've tamed someone. Yeah. Oh.
Okay, cool.
Well, thank you, Karen.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for the interesting points in the debate. Just out of while you're here, is there anything you'd like to see more of in future? If I were to do another webinar or something, what would you find useful or interesting?
Is that asking me and David and Elif, maybe? Not just, or just me?
You can always email with it afterwards.
Yeah.
But I was just curious.
I think communication, sort of oral communication skills, as in how we relate to people, I think all of that, all aspects of that to me is interesting.
I think that's a good one, actually, because I think that's one of the, I think if I could probably think of anything that I've sort of heard people maybe feeling anxious about, is, now that I'm going to say post-COVID, but there's the different forms of communication, and also going back into direct chatting and discussion and meeting with people. I think there's probably quite a few social skills that haven't been practiced in a while. And I mean, even in person, the timing's off. People are waiting for Zoom to do its thing, or they're pausing at odd points in the conversation because sometimes they're not actually used to there being no lag.
Yes, something, in fact, one that could be an interesting sort of part is connected to that is just networking generally. So I quite enjoy networking. I quite enjoy kind of trying to have lots of different conversations, sort of making it into an opportunity, and sort of finding out something interesting about everybody I talk to, and realizing that either we have a dull conversation and neither of us feels good, or we get onto something interesting, and then we find a way of moving on. I think that's a part of the difficulty, but that, I think that could be an interesting subject, Karen, if it's sort of within your remit and your what you're interested in, but how we can make the most of those kind of potentially awkward sort of work professional networking events, and at the same time be holding a plate of canapes, or plate of food and a drink, and having to talk.
Well, if you work out that secret, do let me know.
Shoulder bags for starters. Don't ever have any sort of bag that you need to carry in your hand. I did that once before, and my wrist really hurt.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much for your help, and thank you very much for your feedback. It was great of you to come. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again. Have a good day. Take care.
Lovely. Thank you, Karen.